Welcome to the Wanderer's History Podcast. This is Vlad Zamfira, and today we will talk about a remarkable, heroic, and quite tragic figure of Venetian 16th century military history. In the previous two episodes, I discussed about the fall of Cyprus and the sieges of Nicosia and Famagusta in the early 1570s. There was a clear distinction between those two events because Famagusta represented the most difficult part to conquer, and as I previously mentioned, that largely came to three factors. One was the formidable fortification of Famagusta. The second was actually having professional Italian sergeants and soldiers garrisoned. And the third, and I would say the most important one, the valiant leadership and organization of one Marcantonio Bragadin, or Bragadino, who tried everything humanly possible to stall and resist Mustafa Pasha's furious attacks in Cyprus for more than 1 year. In the end, because of lack of gunpowder, food, water, the grave deterioration of the walls of Famagusta, Bragadin decided that he had to surrender in order to save the people and to not repeat the slaughter that occurred in the previous year at the capital Nicosia. It was clear that the Venetians and the Holy League would not deploy and engage the Ottoman forces by land or sea. By August 1571, Famagusta remained the only Venetian-controlled settlement in Cyprus, cut out from any resupplies after Marco Quirini's fortunate success in the previous year. Continuing the fight would have meant sure death and the near destruction of what was the marvelous city of Famagusta. With the slight risk of repeating myself, I will retell the beginning of what seemed to be an amicable surrender by the Famagustan garrison as told by Paolo Paruta's and Calepio's accounts. So in the account of Paolo Paruta, referring to the siege of Famagusta, he said that Marcantonio Bragadin, realizing that there's no realistic chance of winning, he decided to surrender, and there was a ceremony that preceded that. Paruta says, quote, "Without further delay, on the evening of the same day, leaving Tiepolo in the city, all the other principal officers, to wit Bragadino, Balione, Martinengo, and Antonio Quirini, a noble Venetian, accompanied by other captains and a few Greek gentlemen, went out on horseback attended by 40 musketeers on foot. The General Bragadino rode in front of the rest under a red umbrella, dressed in purple with the ordinary robes of his office, and followed by the others named. When they arrived at the pavilion of the Pasha, they were received with great ceremony, and, their arms being laid aside, they were introduced into the presence of Mustafa. He conversed with them for some time on various matters, dissembling his inmost thoughts, but at last, trying to find some pretext for giving effect to the savagery which his fierce spirit had conceived, he required some guarantee that the vessels which he lent them would be sent back. Bragadino replied that he was not bound to this under the capitulation, nor had he officers whom he would leave behind, whom Mustafa would accept as hostages. Mustafa pointed to Quirini and added that he must remain in the camp. The person of this youth declared his courage and noble birth. This, and the fact that he was the son of Niccolo Quirini, who had been in charge of the fortifications of Nicosia and had given his family name to one of its bastions, made him conspicuous among his companions and better known to Mustafa. Bragadino firmly refused, of his own free will, to give him up. The Pasha could no longer control his passion and burst into a torrent of abuse, fiercely accusing our men of having put to death certain Mussulmans, prisoners in their hands, contrary to the usages of war and the dictates of humanity. His talk added fuel to his rage, and he ordered them all to be bound. They were led out of the pavilion. He set free the hostages who were still in his camp and caused Baglioni, Martinengo, Querini, and the rest to be hacked in pieces by his soldiers, a pitiful spectacle, and a fate all unworthy of these brave men, who might have hoped to receive from soldiers, enemies, though they were, rewards, not punishment for valor shown in war. Bragadino was reserved for greater torments. He was obliged to witness this cruelty and many times to endure the pains of death before he was released from life. For they made him stretch out his neck, but, unwilling to kill him on the spot, merely cut off his ears. Those who were first to embark fared no better than the rest. They were chained and condemned to suffer in the harshest servitude, long and severe hardships. To some fortune was more kind. These, from sundry chances, were the last to remain in the city, and, becoming the prizes of individual soldiers, were quickly and easily released by their captors for a small ransom, which the Turks feared to lose, for Mustafa had strictly forbidden the holding of private prisoners, as he wished to glorify his triumphant return to Constantinople by the greatest possible number of slaves. Among these, Tiepolo was of too exalted a position to win his safety. He was made a prisoner and condemned by the Pasha to the disgrace of death by hanging at the yardarm of a galley. But it is a tearful story we have to tell of Bragadino, whose manifold forms of martyrdom these cruelest, vilest of men caused him to suffer. After insults and wild mockery, he was led into the square of Famagusta, and there bound to the stones of the pillory and flayed alive, while Mustafa stood to the end on a terrace of a palace to feast his eyes and bestial heart on the weird and cruel sight. Incredible was the courage which this bravest of heroes showed in all his terrible torments, a courage which ought to preserve and grace his memory throughout the ages. But the fury of Mustafa's anger was not yet exhausted, and he ordered that the skin should be filled with straw and set on a cow. In bitter mockery, the red umbrella under which the living Bragadino had ridden to the camp was held over it. It was carried throughout the city, and finally, on his departure, it was hung on the yard of a gallery, that he might parade his infamous trophy before the inhabitants of the coast towns which he passed. The reason which moved Mustafa to this fiendish cruelty is not clear. Some said that as the soldiers had missed the booty promised to them from the sack of the city, he wished by the punishment of a few to avenge the deaths of the many men he had lost in the siege, and give him kind of satisfaction to his army. Others again, that irritated by the length and obstinacy of the defense, and by the loss of certain friends very dear to him, he had already sworn to take some terrible vengeance. But there were yet some who believed that the spirit of Mustafa, a man so given to anger that once moved, he was wont to grow furious and actually mad, was excited to frenzy and scorn on seeing Bragadino and his companions come to his pavilion with so large an armed escort and so richly clothed, as though they were rather victors than vanquished. This seems but a trifling excuse for so savage a crime, but the time which he allowed to pass between the first sentence and the latter, and more cruel tortures, lends it some probability. It was mere madness which stirred him to rage, even against the dead. He entered the Episcopal Church of St. Nicolo, caused the graves to be opened and the bones scattered. He destroyed the altars and the images of the saints, and committed other bestial and cruel acts, for which he was much blamed, even by his own people. The city thus acquired Order was taken at once carefully to clear the ditches of the ruins of the wall, to raise all the forts and fill all the trenches outside, and to repair all that had been destroyed within. Thus the fortress was soon restored to its original condition, and made even more secure and defensible than it had been before. End quote. That was the short but revealing account of Paruta, what happened at the end of the siege of Famagusta and the horrible death of Marcantonio Bragadin. Calepio's account is rather similar. Calepio also had the advantage of foresight, and his account differs from Paruta's in the sense that while Paruta said that the Mustafa Pasha's attitude evolved from peaceful to rather extremely violent, Calepio says that from the very beginning Mustafa had a silent rage about him, just waiting for the slightest of pretexts to erupt. Calepio said, quote, "So they went to Mustafa's tent, who at first received them courteously and made them sit down. They passed from one subject to another. Then a complaint arose that during the truce, Signor Bragadino had caused certain slaves to be put to death. There was not a word of truth in it, but Mustafa, rising in anger, would scarcely listen to what his visitors said and ordered them to be bound. They were defenseless, for they were compelled to lay aside their arms before entering the tent, and thus bound were led one by one into the open square before the tent and cut to pieces in Mustafa's presence. Then twice and thrice he made Signor Bragadino, who showed no sign of fear, stretch out his neck as though he would strike off his head, but spared his life and cut off his ears and nose, and as he lay on the ground Mustafa reviled him, cursing our Lord and saying, quote, 'Where now is thy Christ, that he doth not help thee?' The General Bragadino made never an answer, but his lofty patience waited the end. Count Hercule Martinengo, one of the hostages, was also bound, but was hidden by one of Mustafa's eunuchs until his chief's fury was past. He did not slay him, but doomed him as long as his soul cleaved to his body to continual death in life, making him his eunuch and slave, so that happy he had he died with the rest a martyr's death. There were 3 citizens in the tent who were released, but the poor soldiers, bound like so many lambs, were hewn in pieces, with 300 other Christians who never dreamed of such gross perfidy and impious savagery. The Christians, who were already embarked, were brutally robbed and thrown into chains. The second day after the murders, August 7, Mustafa first entered the city. He caused Signor Tiepolo, captain of Bafo, who was left in Signor Bragadino's room, to be hanged by the neck, as well as the commandment of the cavalry. On August 17, a day of evil memory, being a Friday and their holiday, Signor Bragadino was led, full of wounds which had received no care, into the presence of Mustafa, on the batteries built against the city, and for all his weakness, was made to carry one basket full of earth up and another down on each redoubt, and forced to kiss the ground when he passed before Mustafa. Then he was led to the shore, set in a slung seat with a crown at his feet, and hoisted on the yard of the gallery of the captain of roads, hung like a stork in view of all the slaves and Christian soldiers in the port. Then this noble gentleman was led to the square. The drums beat, the trumpets sounded, and before a great crowd they stripped him and made him sit amid every insult on the grating of the pillory. Then they stretched him on the ground and brutally flayed him alive. His saintly soul bore all with great firmness, patience, and faith, never losing heart but ever with the sternest constancy, reproaching them for their broken faith. With never a sign of wavering, he commended himself to his Saviour, and when their steel reached his navel, he gave back to his Maker his truly happy and blessed spirit. His skin was taken and stuffed with straw, carried round the city, and then hung on the yard of a galliot, was paraded along the coast of Syria with great rejoicings. The body was quartered, and a part set on each battery. The skin, after its parade, was placed in a box together with the head of the brave captain Hestor Baglione, and those of St. Luigi Martinengo, Bragadino, and Querini, and were all carried to Constantinople and presented to the Grand Signior, who caused them to be put in his prison. And I, who was a captive, chained in that prison as spy of the Pope, on my liberation, tried to steal that skin, but could not. End quote. Now again, Angelo Calepio of Cyprus, he was a doctor in theology of the Order of Preachers, and he was Vicar General of the province of Terra Santa. And he was actually there. He describes the sieges of Nicosia and Famagusta. Again, he was captured, he was carried to Constantinople, he was ransomed, and again imprisoned by Kilish Ali as a papal spy. So not only did he have a monastic order, but he was also involved politically with the papacy as a spy. It was believed that Calepio came from a family in Bergamo, in Italy. So, with the level of detail exposed by Baruta, by Calepio, and others, Bragadin's death was a horrific tale. He was indeed a martyr, but the way he died at the hands of the Ottomans could be considered as a metaphor to the way Cyprus, one of the most noble and valuable Venetian dominions, fell into the hands of the Ottomans through sheer destruction. And the conquest of Cyprus was an event mourned by the Venetians at home in the terraferma. Bear in mind, Lepanto had not happened yet, and it was obviously a sign of the decline of the line of St. Mark, the power of the Republic of Venice fading with the loss of Cyprus. Now, of course, Crete still remained part of the Venetian Commonwealth for at least 7 decades. But this violent Ottoman takeover of Cyprus scarred Venetian politics, the Venetian military, and also Venetian artists wanted to represent this. Now, great painter Titian, he had a project after hearing what happened at Famagusta with Marcantonio Bragadin. He had a painting called Flaying of Marsyas. It took Titian 6 years to complete this painting, and it is a rather baffling piece of art. First of all, it is unfinished, so there could be missing elements from the final painting that Titian wanted to implement. Second of all, the story is rather allegorical. At first sight, one might think it is a depiction of the ancient Greek myth that told the story of Marsyas, a satyr who foolishly dared to challenge the god Apollo to a singing contest. A classic Greek story of hubris and challenging a god. This may well be the case. Or the more nuanced, subtle interpretation could be the one showing the darkness of the Dionysiac and the Apollonian. However, that might not be the case, and I will shortly return to this point. Titian was born in Venice and had patrons from the Republic, and had a profound understanding of the politics and history of Venice. Later on, the papacy and the Habsburgs would also become sponsors and donors to him. The timing of this painting, the Flaying of Marsyas, seems, however, of crucial importance. An exact date of the commencement of the painting is unknown. It is generally believed to be at some point in 1570, when the Fourth Ottoman-Venetian War began. The last modifications to the painting were in 1576, 3 years after the capitulation and defeat of the Republic, and against the Ottomans, and 5 years after the decisive siege of Famagusta in 1571. As I mentioned in the previous episode, Bragadin's death was slow and excruciating. Mustafa had broken his initial agreement to allow a peaceful transition of the people of Famagusta to Venice, after considering to be wronged by the Venetian captains who, supposedly according to the Ottomans, lied about the death of dozens of Turkish prisoners taken hostages during the siege of Famagusta. After this, as Paruta and Calepio said, all hell broke loose. Bragadin chained, forced to watch the hanging of his lieutenants, and so on and so forth. When the Venetian senators, patricians, noblemen, and common folk heard about the horrific death, the story of Marcantonio Bragadin's death, he was mourned almost as much as the Signori mourned the loss of Cyprus, the jewel of Venice's Commonwealth. After that, outrage followed. Without a shred of a doubt, Titian must have known about this tragic story at the early stages of the painting, and it is possible that the graphic violence of this painting to be inspired by the tragic death of Bragadin himself. Of course, he took in account the myth of Marsyas the satire, but he wanted to have most likely a subtle reference to Bragadin's death. As a side note, if you have an analogy of what happened with the Flaying of Marsyas, you have the satyr who was flayed by Apollo. It is highly unlikely that in Titian's view, Marcantonio Bragadin to be associated with Marsyas, a satyr, and thus a symbol of hedonism, of the Dionysiac, and thus of darkness. You cannot associate that with someone of such great honor, such as Bragadin. Furthermore, Titian and the Venetians would have never considered Mustafa Pasha to be an Apollonian figure. Ironically, Selim II, the sot, the drunkard sultan of the Ottoman Empire, he was more like a satyr, like Marsyas. To conclude, the horrific death of Marcantonio Bragadin represents a telling, metaphoric end of Venetian rule of Cyprus. The loss of Cyprus was a blow to the Venetian military, finances, and influence in the Eastern Mediterranean. By the end of all of this, Bragadin achieved martyrdom, representing Venetian ideals at the time, and so his name was not inscribed only in Cypriot history, but also of the Signor